Now, leave none standing.
I have not come this far to be stopped! The future I have planned will not be jeopardized! Now you will taste true power!
Soon, the heart of your world will beat no more! You are not prepared! The end has come! Let the unraveling of this world commence!
Hey guys, what's up? MadSeason here, and this is the evolution of World of Warcraft. This is a series where I take a step back and look at how the game has evolved all the way back from its release back in 2004 to what it is today. In this episode, I'd like to talk about the first expansion for World of Warcraft, and that's the Burning Crusade. The year is 2007, just a little over 2 years since the original release of World of Warcraft. Being the first expansion, people didn't really know what to expect. Due to all of the new features, changes, and the increased level cap, some people said that it would be the downfall of the game. Others were more optimistic, however, eager for the new journey that awaited them. They thought, just like how the original game captivated them, the expansion would only add to that further and it would be a home run. But what really happened was a grand slam. So without any further delay, let's start episode 2 of the evolution of World of Warcraft, the Burning Crusade. If you're prepared, that is. So, as I said, this was the very first expansion. The game overall was doing exceptionally well at this point, and it was starting to become, quote, the MMO. So, an expansion continuing the experience was inevitable. It was announced fairly early on at BlizzCon 2005. The trailer teased that we were going to continue the events that happened in Warcraft 2 and 3. We were going to go through the dark portal that was created by the last Guardian Medivh, and visit the shattered home of the Orcs, Draenor, now known as the Outland. Since its destruction, the Burning Legion returned and are amassing forces for an invasion upon Azeroth, and the focus of the expansion was to thwart their efforts. This portal has caused a lot of problems, hasn't it? I guess it would be too simple if we were able to just destroy the stone structure to stop these end-of-the-world invasions. Oh, hey, wait a second. Anyways, back on subject. The Burning Legion is here, along with the returning villains, Illidan Stormrage and Kael'thas Sunstrider, to name just 2. So, we're taking the fight to them before it's too late, just like how Khadgar led his expedition through the portal long ago. It was also unveiled that the old world would be getting updates as well. The home of the last Guardian, Karazhan, was sparked to life by the reopening of the dark portal, and the mysterious Caverns of Time would open up. In here, you would be able to do dungeons and raids that let you experience events of the past, such as the opening of the Dark Portal in the Black Morass, the battle for Mount Hyjal where you fend off the Eredar demon, Archimonde, and many more. It was with this expansion, I think, was when they really started to ramp up the storytelling and the lore behind the game. They wanted it to be more than just an MMO in the Warcraft universe. They wanted an epic journey from beginning to end, taking you through the story in this huge world that they created. And I think it's where a lot of people started to pay attention to the actual story of the game. But the main course for any expansion isn't the story, but rather the features. Just a ton of new features were introduced. We had 7 new zones in the new continent, the Outland, 2 new races, the Draenei for Alliance and Blood Elves for Horde, with 2 new starter leveling zones for both races, along with matching capital cities. Several new high-level dungeons, the introduction of heroic mode, more raids, the jewel crafting profession, flying mounts, a new battleground, the new arena PvP game mode, hundreds and hundreds of new quests, new reputations, and once again, one amazing experience. The already massive world just got a little bit bigger. So, we have a lot to talk about, to say the least. What I'd like to start off with though is something I honestly skimmed past in part 1 of the series, and that's the community. Don't worry, we'll get to the BC stuff soon. I just have to address this quickly since it's too important to be left out. And it was true for the Burning Crusade as well. One of the main things people will bring up that's changed with the game over time is the sense of community and overall social aspects of the game. It was the most prominent in Vanilla and the Burning Crusade, I'd say. The best way to describe it is, well, it felt like a community. You'd be hanging out in your capital city, Ironforge or Orgrimmar, and you would recognize people walking past you. Like, hey, I leveled with that guy a couple weeks back, or I did a dungeon with him. In PvP Battlegrounds, you'd recognize that guy that always tops the charts, and he's in an all-star team pushing for rank 14. Or, you'd run into that one pre-made group that would just steamroll you. You recognized everyone. Popular posters on the forums, guilds that built reputations, that one enchanter that had every pattern, everyone. It was like the Cheers of gaming. It gave you more of an identity, and you felt more in touch with everything. Everyone had a reputation, and because of that, there were consequences to your actions, either positive or negative. There was a reason to wanting to be the best rogue, or not acting like a jerk to everyone. Over time, as the game got cross-realm battlegrounds, cross-realm zoning, the dungeon finder, raid finder, and all of these other tools of convenience, it's an aspect of the game that's pretty much vanished. To prove my point, just go find a dungeon in the group finder. I mentioned this recently in one of my other videos, but it's too relevant to skip, so sorry if this sounds redundant. But nowadays, if you go through a dungeon with the group finder, everything is so face rolled to the point to where there's no communication. If anyone even utters a single word at all, no one even calls you by your name, instead demoting you to your class or role, like pull tank, food mage, keep up rogue, and etc. Now, don't get me wrong, I don't think those tools of convenience such as the dungeon finder and whatnot are bad things. I think it was inevitable to get features like that. The game has to evolve eventually. All I'm saying is that it isn't so black and white, and stuff like that does come at a cost. While convenient, being able to simply queue up for a dungeon with a click of a button and get teleported to the instance with 4 random people takes a lot of interaction out of the game, and that's the key to MMOs. It's that interaction is what makes them special. Massively multiplayer online role-playing game. Back during Vanilla or the Burning Crusade, you had to find the dungeon, chat with your group mates on how to reach it, fight together to even get to the entrance, and then you could start. And the dungeons themselves were much harder, basically requiring that communication and planning. And with the introduction of heroic mode in Burning Crusade specifically, it was taken to an extreme. Being this involved and difficult to even set up forced you to work together and talk with one another. You connected with other people, and to make things easier on yourself in the future, you would add each other as friends, do more dungeons with each other, or maybe even just normal quests. Eventually, you would join the same guild and meet more people. Like I said, it was a community. Now, with everything being doable with a click of a button, things being so easy and self-explanatory that no communication ever happens aside from being yelled at for screwing up, it's something that's become muddled over time. Your guild is now your community. It's no longer the server, partly due to cross-realm zoning and other aspects. In fact, I have a little exercise for you. Go to your major city in whatever expansion you're watching this video, and go around and note people's names. The next day at the same time, do the same thing, and again the day after that, and while you're doing this, take note of how many people you recognize from the days before. It's nearly impossible because you're grouped with what seems like 100 different servers. What used to be a recognizable community is now a blurry mess of random people cycled in and cycled out. A new litter with each day. It's an interesting series of events, I think, and I believe it's one of the main points behind the whole vanilla or Burning Crusade versus current argument that you see so often now. A lot of the time, I think it's not necessarily about the state of the game, but rather the state of the community and how it's been changed by the state of the game. And it's very important when you're talking about how the game has evolved as a whole. So, this community aspect was something that was still true in the Burning Crusade in my opinion, because from what I recollect, the Burning Crusade was basically just vanilla, but with more stuff and more polish. Anyways, now that we got that out of the way, let's get into the meat of this video, and those are all of the new features. Remember, I'm pitching this video to you as if it were 2007, and all of this stuff was new. So, let's go back in time, shall we? I guess the best place to start is where everyone started, going through the Dark Portal and entering the first zone of the expansion, the Hellfire Peninsula. This was the first thing that you saw when starting off the expansion, and what a sight it was. In the distance you had the Hellfire Citadel, which Khadgar had besieged long ago. A giant Pit Lord, Infernals, Dreadlords, and other demons block your way and are battling it out at the foot of the Dark Portal. You would see a giant mechanical monstrosity in the distance. As soon as you stepped through that portal and saw what awaited you, you knew you were in for quite the experience. The questing experience itself was pretty good. Just like in vanilla, you had a nice mix of solo and group quests. But I think in general, the quests started to get a little more interesting and more story was being added to them, and there were fewer Kill 10 Boars quests. Although they were still present. Hey, it is an MMO at the end of the day. You gotta have a quest to kill 10 boars. As I mentioned, 7 new zones, and they were all quite varied. You had the Scorched Lands of the Hellfire Peninsula, the Soggy Marshlands of Zangarmarsh, the Spires of Blade's Edge Mountain, the chaotic and unstable Netherstorm, the lush green Terracar Forest, the rolling hills of Nagrand, and the demon-infested Shadowmoon Valley. No two zones looked the same, which kept things nice and fresh. And it wasn't just in looks. Some of them had some unique flair to them. In Hellfire, you have a PvP objective where you capture Colosseums, as well as Zangarmarsh. You also had the Hala PvP area in Nagrand, and so on. Fun little side things to do to take a break from leveling, or just some PvP to do endgame if you didn't feel like Battlegrounds. The new level cap was 70, plus 10 from vanilla, so there wasn't as much leveling just due to there being less levels obviously, but that's pretty much commonplace for expansions I think. If we're talking about unnerfed vanilla, leveling like I mentioned in part 1 could take months. 60 to 70 on average for most people I think was 1, maybe 2 or 3 weeks depending on how much you played of course. And this is true for any expansion, but it was nice to finally progress your character in a way other than gearing. Vanilla had been in release for 26 months at this point, so people were ready to move on and grow their characters. This was when you had the old talent system still, so you had 10 more talent points to add to your characters, along with brand new talents added to each tree. And along with those, new abilities that everyone got. The classes were evolving, and a lot of the problems that were prevalent in vanilla were disappearing. You were starting to see non-warrior tanks and previously unused specs more often. Warlocks became something more than just a support class, Druids became something more than just their Innervate spell, and etc. When you think of an expansion, most people immediately go to the new dungeons, raids, maybe a new class, etc. But something overlooked is class balance, and the Burning Crusade made great strides in that area. Now, it wasn't perfect, and I don't think we'll ever achieve perfect balance, but I think most people would say that it was a definite improvement over vanilla at least. Another big aspect was the fact that we were getting two new races, the Draenei for Alliance and the Blood Elves for Horde. The Draenei came from another planet called Argus and were originally known as the Eridar. Argus was their home planet, and they were basically driven out and they were trying to escape the corruption of the Dark Titan, Sargeras, and the Burning Legion. Their leader is a prophet by the name of Velen, and he was led through the cosmos by other beings called Naru in search of a safe planet to land on. Actually, initially they landed on Draenor, but they were driven out by the original Horde. A handful of Eridar boarded a ship called the Exodar and took off again. This time, they crash-landed onto Azeroth and joined the Alliance, naming themselves the Draenei, which means exiled ones in their native language. The Blood Elves lived in the northern forests of Lordaeron and were centered around the sacred Sunwell, a font of arcane energy created by using a small sample taken from the Well of Eternity. In the events of the Third War, however, 90% of the population was killed by Arthas and his Scourge army. He used the Sunwell to revive the Lich Kel'Thuzad and forever tainted it, leaving behind a decimated population. Their prince, Kael'thas Sunstrider, who was absent at the time, rushed back and named the surviving population Blood Elves, in honor of their fallen comrades. Over time, they became addicted to the energies of the Sunwell, and with that now gone, they became weakened and despondent. Kael'thas journeyed to the Outland to find a way to save his people. Unfortunately though, he had become addicted to the Burning Legion's fell energy instead, and became a minion of the Eridar demon Kil'jaeden. He lost the support of most Blood Elves, and they allied themselves with the Horde and joined them in their assault in the Outland to find some answers, and hopefully a solution to their addiction to magic. I remember it was a pretty controversial thing back in the day. At this point, the Horde had orcs, tauren, undead, and trolls, all very gritty and barbarous races. Blood Elves, on the other hand, were the exact opposite of this, and it didn't sit well with a lot of Horde players. They didn't want their image tarnished, and they wanted the Elves to remain on the Alliance side. Nevertheless, these were the two races that we got. Mixed reactions, as I said. Something important to mention though is that with these two new races came a big change in balance, and that was the fact that the Alliance could now make shamans and the Horde could now make paladins. Both of these classes had their strengths and weaknesses, and back then, one faction had the edge over the other in certain fights. The Paladin's blessings versus the Shaman's totems. All of this was now normalized because both factions could pick them with the Draenei Shaman and the Blood Elf Paladin. Anyways, another big new thing was JEWELCRAFTING, the 10th primary profession in the game. This was important not only as another profession, but it was also another way to upgrade your gear and progress your character. This was the introduction of the whole socket and gemming system, and it was a little different initially. Nowadays, it's pretty simplified with only prismatic sockets, but back then you had certain color sockets and certain color gems. And if you matched them up, you got a bonus. So this just added another layer on top of enchanting as a way to fine-tune your gear and make things a little more interesting. A bit of complexity and character customization that's been lost over the years. Another big feature, and what's probably the most controversial thing about the expansion, was the introduction of flying mounts. Once you reached level 70, you could buy training that allowed you to fly anywhere in the Outlands, and you didn't have to ride those wimpy griffins either. There was a faction that allowed you to actually ride dragons, or drakes rather. They were tied behind daily quests and egg collecting, and it was quite the epic thing at the time. I mean, come on, who didn't want to ride a drake as their mount? But, little did Blizzard know at the time, flying in general opened up a huge can of worms that remains open to this day, with Blizzard themselves changing and rechanging their minds if it's a good thing or a bad thing. It was a pretty highly requested feature in vanilla, as you can imagine. Traveling was a journey itself, and people wanted to bypass that so they could get to where they wanted to go quicker. And that was the case with the Outlands at least. It was fairly expensive. The slow flying speed cost a couple hundred gold, not including the actual mount cost, and the faster speed was around 5,000 gold with discounts at certain reputation levels. So, it took quite a while to work towards that, and it certainly kept you busy in the gold making scene. The argument was, and still is, while the traveling is easier and it's more convenient, there's that word again, it also comes with downsides. One of many is that it diminishes world PvP. If people can fly everywhere, there's way fewer confrontations that you used to have in vanilla. The old Terran Mill versus South Shore hub existed because it was one of the first areas where the Horde and Alliance ran into each other on the ground in the same questing area or just on the road. That doesn't happen with flying, and I'd wager that if flying was in vanilla originally, we never would have had that as a PvP hotspot, or at least it wouldn't have been as epic as it was. Another issue people argue is that it makes the world seem smaller. Now, the Outland was pretty small compared to Azeroth, but the fact that you could fly over everything made it seem smaller than it actually was. You have to keep in mind, people were going from grounded in 2 giant continents to flying in a comparatively bite-sized piece of land. It's just another thing to add to the pile of that whole convenience argument. It was a big step, and although you could only fly in Outlands and in Azeroth you remained grounded, it eventually leaked out into the Wrath of the Lich King expansion, Cataclysm, and onwards to where we can fly anywhere we want. I won't say which side of the argument I'm on since I want to remain the neutral messenger and narrator, but as you can tell from all of these points, it was and still is a pretty controversial thing, and it's important to take into account when talking about the evolution of the game. Let's get to the highlight of any expansion, and that's the end game. Let's start with PvP. A new battleground was added in this expansion, the Eye of the Storm. It looked similar visually to one of the zones in the Outlands, the Netherstorm, and it played like a hybrid of the Arathi Basin and Warsong Gulch battlegrounds. You can capture points, or a flag in the middle. It was the 4th battleground of the game, and it was pretty good. At this point, we had 4 in total, with the others being the Warsong Gulch, Arathi Basin, and Alterac Valleys, so it was a good variety at the time. The PvP system at this point was changed as well, away from the old Rank 14 system. In general, if I had to summarize, I'd say that it was more accessible. With the Rank 14 system, you competed with players of your own faction to climb the ranks, and a very small percentage of the population actually maxed it out. It was insanely grindy. I have a buddy who grinded it out back in the day, and he had to throw out his computer chair after he reached it because he had to play it so much. With this new system though, you got your gear based off the new arena system, so let's talk about that. This was probably the biggest thing in the realm of PvP for this expansion. And a little known fact is that it was something that was experimented with back in the alpha of the game before Blizzard instead decided to focus on objective-based PvP. So, at this point for a while now, it was a huge request to be able to go against other people in even skirmishes, a challenge of skill, teamwork, and let's be honest here, class composition. Arenas became the new endgame for PvP, replacing that Rank 14 grindfest, and awarded amazing loot and mounts if you were good enough, that is. This was back when you had actual arena teams that you could name and required charter signatures to make. You could have a roster of players on your team and pick and choose the best composition you have available and run some matches. Battlegrounds sort of became seen as minor compared to arenas, and the loot awarded reflected that. If you wanted the best gear, you had to do arenas and be good at them. You could get gear through Battlegrounds, but it was typically a tier behind arena. There were 3 maps initially, the Ring of Trials in Nagrand, the Circle of Blood in the Blade's Edge Mountains, and the Ruins of Lordaeron in the Tearsfall Glades. And those first 2 were actually present in the world too, by the way. Like I said, they tried their best to keep the world PvP scene alive in the face of flying mounts, and you could visit these arenas at any time for some free-for-all PvP action. Each one had a unique design with several areas of line of sight to evade your opponents, so it wasn't just a game of Rochambeau. Positioning was, and still is, key. And keep in mind that this was also back when there weren't any mechanics to limit how long matches went on, So you had skirmishes that would last for hours and hours, and the first team to take a pee break lost. The Battle of the Bladders. Another pretty big thing was the introduction of the resilience stat. PvP in vanilla was known for being a little bursty, you know, just a little bit. Slightly bursty. Resilience was basically a new stat introduced to slow things down a bit, so you had fights that lasted more than 5 seconds. It initially reduced your chance to be crit, and the amount of damage those crits did, and it was later changed to just flat out reduce damage, and was eventually removed entirely in the Draenor expansion, I believe. So, overall, PvP was in a pretty good state instance-wise, but due to flying, world PvP wasn't ideal. It was there, you had battles in the PvP areas I mentioned earlier, such as Hala, and they tried their best to keep it alive, but I think due to flying mainly, you never again saw battles as big as the old Terran Mill versus South Shore Hotspot. When you ask people exactly why the Burning Crusade is their favorite expansion, a lot of the time they'll tell you it's because of the endgame PvE. By the time it was all said and done, this expansion held a whopping 16 dungeons and 9 raids. Starting with the dungeons, you had quite the smorgasbord. They were typically grouped up into small hubs and focused on thwarting a specific faction of enemies. The Hellfire Citadel held a selection of dungeons with a Fel Orc theme. These are orcs that were created using the blood of the former ruler of the Outlands, Magtheridon. Illidan overthrew him and used his blood to produce an army of these crazed Fel Orcs to hold the Hellfire Peninsula. Interesting though that there's no female Fel Orcs. I wonder what's up with that. The Citadel held 3 dungeons total, the Hellfire Ramparts, the Blood Furnace, and the Shattered Halls. And it also held a raid called Magtheridon's Lair. This was a single boss encounter, similar to the old Onyxia's Lair in vanilla in a sense. As I said, Magtheridon is the former lord of the Outland and the head honcho pit lord, so a pretty big character here. You also had the Slave Pens, Underbog, and Steam Vault located in the Coilfang Reservoir in the Zangarmarsh zone. Nearby was the Serpent Shrine Cavern raid, which was sort of the home base for all of the Naga in the Outland. So, the raid and all of the dungeons focused on culling that Naga threat and trying to restore order to the area. And over in the Terracart Forest, you have the Auchendoon, which held 4 dungeons: the Mana Tombs, the Auchenite Crypts, Sethic Halls, and the Shadow Labyrinth. The Auchendoon was a former Draenei holy site, but has since fallen into the hands of the Shadow Council and other beings. In these dungeons, you fought quite the variety of enemies: Ethereals, a new type of enemy introduced with the Burning Crusade, the Burning Legion itself, undead enemies, and the Arakoa also had a presence there. This is a bird-like humanoid race, also new with this expansion. Another dungeon hub was the Tempest Keep in the Netherstorm Zone. This is the throne of the Great Kilthoth Sunstrider, who can be found in the Eye Raid. And it also held 3 dungeons, the Botanica, the Arcatraz, and the Mechanar, all 3 having a heavy presence of the Legion and Blood Elves following the Rogue Prince of Qualthalas. This hub was a little unique because the dungeons were floating high up in the air, and you actually needed a flying mount to enter them, or a warlock, although I believe initially even warlock summons were disabled for the hub. And the last major hub was actually located in the Old World in the Caverns of Time. Although in my opinion, the storytelling wasn't in full swing until Wrath, this was when they started to ramp it up to try and explain to players the backstory of the major characters or just big events in the Warcraft universe. Not just through questing like I mentioned earlier, but dungeons as well. The Burning Crusade, I think, was the start of turning the game from kill bosses, get loot, to an epic story with so many different and interesting characters. The RPG part in MMORPG. We had 2 dungeons and 1 raid in this hub. The opening of the Dark Portal, where you actually see the last Guardian, Medivh, opened the gateway that allowed the orcs to invade from Draenor, a huge event in the franchise's history. And you also have the escape from Durnhold, where you release Thrall from captivity in the Hillsbrad foothills, and you learn some backstory with him as well. The whole Caverns of Time concept is a great tool to show you firsthand the big events in the game's history, and in later expansions, Blizzard would take full advantage of it with instances such as the culling of Stratholme from Wrath or the Well of Eternity from Cataclysm. And it of course held the raid from the Burning Crusade, the battle for Mount Hyjal, the final scene for the Third War, and the end of the Legion's first invasion on Azeroth. Now, I'll go into more detail with the raids in a bit, but first I'd like to talk about the dungeons a bit more since these are still pretty major. As I mentioned earlier, a new feature was the fact that you can now do something called Heroic Mode for dungeons. As you know, these are basically scaled up versions of normal dungeons that give you better loot, and back then, they weren't a joke. Some were even considered impossible unless you had gear from the Karazhan, the lowest tier raid in the Burning Crusade. They required a skilled group with solid coordination and lots of crowd control because some packs were simply too big to tank and AoE down like how it's done nowadays. This provided sort of an endgame for 5-man content for a good while until people started getting geared up from the higher tier raids, of course. So, very difficult to clear them, and if you can believe it, very difficult to zone in as well. To enter the Heroic Mode, you used to have to get a key from a reputation associated with the Dungeon Hub. For the Auchendoun, it was the Lower City faction, for the Hellfire Citadel, it was Honorhold for Alliance and Thrallmore for Horde, and so on for the other dungeons. And to get these keys, you initially needed the Revered level, and every party member had to get them to zone in. So there was a lot of grinding to even zone into the instances, and some required additional keys to even unlock the gate leading to the dungeon. These were usually locked behind long quest chains. All of this is called attunement or keying, and in the Burning Crusade it was legendary. To zone into the Black Temple, you had to attune for Hyjal, but to zone into Hyjal, you had to attune for Serpent Shrine. But to attune for Serpent Shrine, you had to attune for Karazhan, but to attune for that, you had to run the Caverns of Time dungeons. You also had to do the Eye Raid in the Tempest Keep, and to attune for that, you had to do 4 heroic dungeons, which of course needed those keys, and it goes on and on. And again, every single raid member had to do this to zone in. I made a whole video about this, that's how in-depth and complicated it was. Unbeknownst to a lot of people these days, even the ability to zone into these dungeons or raids is something that they take for granted. And I kind of liked it. You had to do quest chains, grind rep, group with people. It was complicated, and it was a goal that you had upon reaching max level aside from just gearing up. Now, it wasn't all sunshine and roses, nothing is ever perfect, and maybe it was just a tad too hardcore, but I think having these long-term goals other than gearing is a key thing for MMOs. So, now that we talked about the attuning for the raids, let's talk about the actual raids. A big change with this expansion was that they were bumped down to 25-man as opposed to 40-man from vanilla. This was done to make things a little easier on guilds in the recruiting realm. Getting 40 people together at a specific time back then was a challenge itself, and if you were to combine it with all of this attuning stuff, it would have been a nightmare. But because of this change, you would also have less room for dead weight. With 40 men, you could maybe get away with having a handful of people who didn't really know what was going on. Maybe a few soccer moms hitting rejuvenation every couple minutes. But with 25, you had less room for that. And for the raids in the Burning Crusade, you had to be on top of your game because some people would argue if you're counting pre-nerfs, the Burning Crusade raids were some of the hardest challenges in the game's history. I don't think it was necessarily the whole raids, but certain bosses within the raids. For the later tiers, there were always 1 or 2 bosses that were just insanely difficult to get past, and combine that with the fact that back then, we were all still learning the game in a lot of ways. Compared to now, take away 10 years of experience and mix that in with the Burning Crusade raiding scene, and you're in for some rough boss fights to say the least. Now, something I have to put out here is that I'm sad to say I didn't get too much raiding done with the Burning Crusade. I was one of those people from vanilla who burnt themselves out grinding my skull against the brick walls known as Cthulhu and Kel'Thuzad. So the Burning Crusade was my off-time expansion. I raided here and there, but I wasn't involved with that hardcore progression like how I was in vanilla. I was on vacation from all of that. I guess you could say I was a filthy casual. That being said though, through research and testimonials from several people who did raid back then, I'll try to paint the most accurate picture that I can. But forgive me if I get some of the details wrong, and feel free to post any corrections in the comments. Something interesting to note here is that these first 5 were actually in the game at the launch of the expansion. Can you believe that? 5 raids right from the start. That's almost twice as much as the whole Warlords of Draenor expansion in its entirety. It's pretty unthinkable these days. The main catch with this though was, as I mentioned, there was heavy attuning tied to these raids, so you couldn't simply zone into anyone you wanted. And with their extreme challenge, you'd pretty much be forced to methodically progress through each tier before moving on to the next. A different style of progression that was more in the power of the players rather than just waiting for Blizzard to release the new raid with a patch. So let's go to the starting point, and that's the 10-man raid, Karazhan. Starting off a little casual here with just a 10-player limit, which was quite the change from the 40-player norm of vanilla. You did have the old Zul'Gurub and the Runes of AQ, which were 20-man, but that was the bare minimum for the raiding experience in vanilla. Unless you want to count the Blackrock Spire, but at least near the end it felt like a dungeon anyways because people usually ran it with just 5 and split it up into 2 halves. But anyways, back to Karazhan. This was of course the Tower of Medivh, the last guardian and the person responsible for opening the Dark Portal in the first place, as I mentioned earlier. The reason why this expansion exists. So, a deep story in the raid setting itself, and the setting in general was just so unique at the time. At this point, we were used to caverns and dungeons, the typical RPG dungeon crawling experience, and stepping foot into this place was a breath of fresh air. The banquet hall, the opera house, the chess room, the stables, the library, each area gave you something new to see, and the whole theme of the raid was just magnificent. It was so good in fact that it was re-released as a dungeon in the Legion expansion, although luckily the original still exists. Counting all of the optional bosses, there were 12 total, holding memorable fights such as the Shade of Iran and his Flame Wraiths. We also had the Opry event, which were 3 different bosses selected at random. The Riding Hood boss is the source of that DBM sound clip that tells you to run away, if you know what I'm talking about.
Run away, little girl! Run away!
Yeah, that one. We of course had the chess event, which speaks for itself, and the completely optional Nightbane boss, which required you to complete a long quest chain before you could summon him. But he was also required for some attuning, so take the word optional lightly. So overall, just an amazing raid, and to this day, it remains the favorite of many players out there. It was the birth of 10-man raiding, something that was explored further in the next expansion, Wrath. It showed that there was interest in a less hardcore raiding experience, one where you didn't have to coordinate 40 different people, something that you could throw together in 10 minutes. Well, if everyone was attuned anyways. But you can kind of see Blizzard continuing this mentality these days with Mythic Plus dungeons, another challenging endgame experience scaled down further to 5 players. The next raid on our list is Gruul's Lair, home of Gruul the Dragon Killer. You may remember he earned this name when he impaled the black dragonflight in the area upon spires, something that you saw in the Blade's Edge Mountain zone where the raid was held. This was a pretty small raid, only holding 2 bosses total, the High King Mulgar and his Ogre Council, and Gruul himself. This raid was unique because it was one that didn't require attuning to enter. You could enter by simply zoning in. Crazy, huh? But this raid was pretty good. It wasn't the main event due to its size, but a worthy raid nonetheless. It's cool to see these big lore characters actually in-game and brought to life in the world of Warcraft. An even smaller raid though was Magtheridon's Lair, the single boss Onyxia style raid that I mentioned earlier. As I said, Magtheridon was the big name pit lord. Illidan eventually arrived in the Outland and imprisoned him below the Hellfire Citadel. You can actually get a cool preview of him in the Blood Furnace dungeon where you see him through the floor of the final boss room. So quite a big character lore-wise and a cool raid. And once again, you didn't need to get attuned to enter. And next we have our first serious raid for BC, and that was the Serpentshrine Cavern. I say serious here because Karazhan, as big as it was just 10 man. Gruul's Lair had just 2 bosses, and Magtheridon just 1. The Serpentine Cavern was a standard 25-man, and it held a respectable 6 bosses. This time, the Naga are in the spotlight. Everyone was pretty familiar with them at this point. These are the creatures that used to be night elves and were transformed along with Queen Ashara herself to these fish-like beings. The whole place is filled with Naga, water elementals, sea giants, any aquatic enemy basically. This was the water level of World of Warcraft. For bosses, we had the elemental Hydros the Unstable, the giant lurker below which you had to fish up, the general Fathomlord Carathris and his minions, the sea giant Morogrim Tidewalker, and Leotheris the Blind. This guy is a little out of place, don't you think? The story with him is that he was one of Illidan's demon hunters, and this guy sort of went insane during his training. He was exiled to the Zanger Marsh, where he eventually wandered into the Serpentine Cavern, where he's been kept prisoner ever since. And the final boss was the handmaiden to Ashara herself, Lady Vash. You may recognize this name from the Cataclysm Zone, Vashir, the underwater highborn city. Overall, a really interesting raid, although in terms of difficulty here, we're just getting started. All 4 of these raids were pretty challenging, but they're lacking in a brick wall boss, like Cthulhu for AQ40 or Razorgore the Untamed for Blackwing Lair for a time. Enter the Eye, Tempest Keep. The Tempest Keep is a former Naru fortress in the Netherstorm Zone, now in the hands of Kael'thas Sunstrider, the Prince of the Blood Elves. There are 4 bosses total in the raid, so it's on the small side in that regard. We have the Phoenix, Alar, the Void Reaver, High Astromancer Solarian, and the Prince himself, Kael'thas. The hardest fight in the raid by far was the Prince. He had 5 phases and required extreme coordination from your whole raid. Looking back, mechanics-wise, it was probably one of the most complex fights. I mean, 5 phases is quite a lot, even by today's standards. But a bright side was that you got free legendaries from this fight. And people say Legion ruined legendaries. It turns out that the true casuals were in the Burning Crusade after all. On a serious note though, these had a limited duration and you could only use them in this fight, so they weren't true legendaries. So it was quite the challenging fight, and not only that, he, along with Lady Vash, were required for the quest to attune you to the next raid, the Battle for Mount Hyjal. 5 more bosses in this one: Rage Winterchill, Anetheron, Khazrogal, Asgalor, and the Eredar demon, Archimond. This is of course the climax to the Third War, and it's a callback to the final mission in Warcraft 3. One of the first raids that was really wide open. It almost felt like a normal zone. Actually, a little fun fact for you is that this was originally planned to be a zone in vanilla. They never finished it, but with a little exploring, you were able to get into it and see what they were cooking. But I think this really shows the possibilities behind the whole time traveling idea with the Caverns of Time, and it's something Blizzard would continue to expand upon. World of Warcraft takes place after a lot of big events, and these caverns allow us to pick and choose key moments in the story to experience, such as the end of the Third War. One of the coolest things introduced in the expansion, I think. The next raid was the big one, and that was the Black Temple. Once known as the Temple of Karabor, this now corrupted temple serves as the lair of Illidan Stormrage and his minions. This came with another extensive attuning process that every member had to go through, even requiring Hyjal attunement to complete. It was the largest raid yet, with 9 bosses total, plenty of demons, fell orcs, naga, a smorgasbord of villains of the Burning Crusade. Plus, they even had a concubine room. I mean, how could you beat that? The final boss was some guy named Illidan Stormrage. I'm not sure if you've heard about him, but he's the one in the cinematics, so he's kind of a big deal. He was the first demon hunter, and he played a big role in defeating the Burning Legion during the Third War. He was quite rash, however, and earned the title the Betrayer after he seemingly defected to the Burning Legion in an attempt to destroy them from within. He was banished by his brother Malfurion, and eventually fled to the Outland where he allied with the Blood Elves and the Broken Draenei. He overthrew Magtheridon and proclaimed himself as the new Lord of the Outland, and ever since has been amassing forces to wipe out the Burning Legion once and for all. That's a very abridged summary, by the way. You should read up on his full story in a wiki since there's much more to it. He dropped the legendary Warglaives of Azeroth, which were mainly used by rogues. This was the 4th official legendary weapon, or 4th and 5th if you want to get technical, I guess. They looked quite, well, legendary. Anyways, the next raid on the list was quite the change in scenery, and that's Zul Aman. This was a 10-man raid, just like Karazhan, focusing on the Amani troll tribe, and it was similar in a lot of ways to Zul'Gurub. The bosses were themed after various animals: Nalarak the bear, Akilzan the eagle, and so on, with the end boss is Zul'Jin, the leader of the Amani trolls, who of course is a fairly big lore character in the game, even having a cameo in the Heroes of the Storm MOBA by Blizzard. Another interesting thing about this raid though was that it had a timed event. You had 20 minutes to kill the first 4 bosses before they execute prisoners, and certain ones gave you more time when you killed them. If you were successful, you were awarded with extra loot and even the Amani Warbear mount. A very unique mount. If I remember correctly, it was the only bear mount at the time. The raid sadly is no longer available in the game, one of the many victims of the Cataclysm expansion with its many remakes. It's now a 5-man dungeon, and you can only get a reskinned version of the bear mount. The last raid we have on our list is the Sunwell. I already told you about its backstory, how it was destroyed by Arthas, and so on. As for its role in the Burning Crusade, well, the remnants of the Sunwell have become a target of the Burning Legion. They want to use its latent powers to summon their commander, Kil'jaeden, also known as the Deceiver. You got a whole new island along with the raid, and a new set of quests to launch an offensive. And we also got another dungeon called the Magister's Terrace, where Kil'thas makes a return. Apparently, from what I heard, his demise in the Eye was merely a setback. But the main focus was still the Sunwell, and with it being the final raid, it was also the most difficult. We had many roadblocks. The bosses were Kalikos, Brutalis, Felmist, the Erdar sisters, Muru, and Kil'jaeden. All of them were extremely challenging, with people often pointing out Muru as being a particular pain in the butt, and it was only after some nerfs that most guilds were able to progress. Kil'jaeden himself also dropped the legendary hunter bow, Thordal the Star's Fury, the first hunter legendary in the game. Overall, an insanely challenging raid, and a fitting capstone to the Burning Crusade expansion. And that was the Burning Crusade expansion for World of Warcraft. If I had to summarize it, I'd say it's basically an extension of vanilla. From that old and tired Dead Horse vanilla versus current argument, a big point people bring up is how hardcore vanilla was compared to current WoW. And the Burning Crusade was the only expansion that didn't let up on it. For the most part anyways. Flying is a pretty big counterpoint to that particular argument. But you could say that it was more hardcore in a lot of ways, especially the attuning. The dungeons were even harder if you count heroic mode, and the raids were arguably just as hard, if not harder, if you count the pre-nerfs. If you ask someone on the vanilla side of the argument if the Burning Crusade was a good expansion, 99% of the time they'll say yes because it was basically vanilla and just more of it. They'll say they like it because back then, the community was still there due to the absence of cross-realm zoning and grouping. They'll say they liked it because the storytelling and the lore were interesting, and because they had other objectives to grind upon hitting the max level aside from just gearing up, and that those grinds were so hard and time-consuming that it felt like a huge accomplishment. They'll say they liked it because the PvP was in a good spot, and they were actually adding onto it with major features like Arena. And they'll also say they liked it because the class balance was vastly improved over vanilla, where you had more than just warrior tanks or priest healers, and that the challenge both inside and outside of the raids was very high. Or maybe they'll say they liked it because it came at the right time in their lives. Although no expansion rules forever, the Burning Crusade to this day lives on in people's hearts as the prime of World of Warcraft. So, that's it for this episode. I hope you enjoyed it, and that I did the expansion justice. I know for a lot of you out there, it's your favorite expansion, so I hope I was able to properly put in words just why people loved it. If you have anything you thought I missed, or just thoughts in general, feel free to share them. Sorry it took so long to make, by the way. The main reason for that is obviously the length of the video, and it's also that I don't want to rush these out. I want to take my time with them so I can make them as good as they can be. And combining that with the fact that at the end of the day my YouTube channel is just a hobby, so I can't justify spending too much time on it and sacrificing other stuff in my personal life. So, as for the next one, which will of course be Wrath, I don't really have an ETA for you. As some of you may know, it is my favorite expansion, so I look forward to covering that, but it just depends on when I get the free time and when the creative juices start flowing. They release these expansions every 2 years, so maybe one of these episodes a year is a good pace to where I won't fall behind or catch up too quickly. Again, no promises though. Not to pull a Blizzard, but soon, trademark. Regardless, I hope you're enjoying the series thus far, and I'll see you in the next episode of the evolution of World of Warcraft.
Farewell for now, mortals. We hope you enjoyed today's video. See you again soon.